All right, well, welcome back to the Colorado ENP study session series. And tonight we're going to talk about 911 administration, and your host will be myself, Jennifer Kirkland, State 911 Program Manager, and Chelsea Parsons. And we also have Connie Johnson with us from the Colorado 911 Resource Center. And Connie, what kinds of words of wisdom do you have for us tonight?
I think that story kind of said it all. Welcome, everybody. Love that you're participating in this.
See, now that's not fair, but before we started the recording, we were having a good time sharing open mic stories, so we'll just leave it at that. So we also have a little bit of a celebration. We have Stephanie here with us with some good news. Stephanie, tell us your good news.
Hey, everyone. So this afternoon, I went and sat for my EMP test, and I have received my preliminary pass. Doesn't give you the exact scores until you get your official document, but I am very excited to share that I more than likely have passed. Thank you, everyone. If I could scream it from the mountaintops as you guys are studying, absolutely know your acronyms. And the test is balanced. It's going to be half on your operational and half on your management. And whatever side you are maybe a little deficient or not quite as strong in, definitely feels like the entire test is written on that. For me, that management section was a doozy. I put a lot of my time and effort into the Legacy 911 and Next Gen 911 and really understanding the fundamentals of that. So when I got hit with that management section in the test, each one of those questions popped up and were a little bit more challenging for me. So, but I am very excited to say that it all was worth it and it came out on the end. So good luck as everyone continues your journey and studying for this. And thank you so very much to this study group. And a big shout out to Tracy Elledge on her study groups that she's done too. Those have been the key to getting me through this. So, but yeah, if anyone has any quick questions, I can try to answer some of them for you.
All right. Thank you
Did
so
you take
much.
the whole time, Stephanie?
Go ahead, Claire.
Did you take the whole time?
I took about 2 hours and I'd say probably 2.5 hours. But I read the question, read all the answers, reread the question, and then made my selection on every single one of them. And I feel like that was a huge help.
Thank you.
And you have a helper.
Yeah, this is my little one, Morgan.
Well, congratulations, Stephanie. We're really, really happy for you. And thanks for sharing your experience.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right, well, we're going to dive in. So as always, thank you for joining us live. And the benefit of having these study sessions be live is that you can ask questions. There's no question that is wrong or too small. Remember, these are being recorded. So if you have the question, chances are someone down the line watching it will also have the question, and it will be extremely helpful to have it asked and answered. I've been having fun on these, being stumped by your questions and having to phone a friend. So thank you for all of the EMPs on this group who are here to help and answer questions and generally just have a good time of it. So don't be afraid to speak up. And with that, we're going to dive into budgeting. So as usual, we've put the section numbers on the slide so you can follow along. And Chelsea Parsons is going to introduce herself, and then she's going to dive right into budgeting. So Chelsea, it's all you.
All right. My name is Chelsea, as you've heard. I was formerly the interim executive director with the Lake County Emergency Communication Center, and I'll be going over the budget section. So an operating budget is an overall budget of everything that goes through the communication center. Each budget process will be different. Some may go through a county or city budget, and some may go through an authority board. But it includes all personnel, utilities, office supplies, rents, leases, system maintenances, and possibly capital investments. So these are formulated on an annual basis, whatever your annual period is. Operating supplies are items that are included in the budget every year. You'll need a detailed document covering revenues and expenditures. Each year, you'll need to review the difference at the end of the year to make sure you're not spending more than you're receiving and to make sure you have a cushion of savings to include for capital investments. Capital investments, or you may need to review if you can increase your revenues.
Keep on this slide or advance?
Sorry, can you advance?
Yep.
And then capital budgets can vary on how long-term they are, but need to be prepared for ahead of time. For example, you save money for when you might need to replace your roof on your house, or if something breaks in your house, you have that savings and that cushion. When you're considering purchasing a new system, CAD system or phone system, something that you don't buy new every year, examine how that hardware integrates with the other equipment in the center. Will the other equipment in the center need to be updated or new apparatus implemented, and how much will that cost? And then also, when you're considering purchasing new systems and the costs associated, you should also consider who's going to be your project manager and if they can handle the additional tasks and what day-to-day tasks will be going on the back burner, or would it be better to hire a third party to manage the large project, and what all costs is associated with that. And then regarding if your staff can handle taking on projects, I will let Jennifer take on the next section.
Thanks, Chelsea. And it's kind of funny to me because budgeting is such a huge activity in PSAP leadership, and those 3 slides are literally the sum total of the section of the ENP study guide. So before I move on to assigning personnel, does anybody have any questions about the budgeting process? Like all the money, 2 paragraphs. Okay. Well, thanks, Chelsea. That was awesome.
You're welcome. I know I wanted to go a lot deeper, and that's why, but keep it 10,000 foot view.
This is great. So yeah, going into budgeting, one of the things you have to think about is the assignment of duties, because your personnel cost is also going to be a big part of any kind of capital budget expense, mostly because those capital expenses come along with project management. And so when they're talking about assignment of duties, they're kind of taking a project management focus on assignment of duties. But in general, whether you're talking about a project management or you're talking about assignment of duties in general in your PSAP, the selection should rest on the unique skills that are required. So what does the project need? And then matching it with the skill set that you have in your PSAP. And that's going to vary depending on the size of your PSAP. It should also be resting on the willingness to do the task to the best of their ability. So if you have someone who has a great skill set but doesn't really want to, that might cause problems down the road if you can't bring them onto your side and have them be absolutely willing. Other things to consider when you're thinking about project costs and the assignment of duties is the person's salary and schedule. So how much is it going to cost to put this person in that role versus someone else? And what is the schedule? Do they have the time to do this assignment? Whoever you choose, that schedule is going to be considered a cost, because during a project management role, they're not going to be performing their routine tasks, especially on a larger scale project. So you need to be thinking about who's going to backfill them, or are you just going to ask them to do both? And what does that do to their workload? So you might be thinking about a substitute person hiring in to fill in for that selected person. So when you assign a person a duty or a task to perform, and again, this is both in project management, but also general assignment of tasks, you need to make sure that they're aware of the timetable for that specific task and the timetable for the overall project and how their tasks fit into the overall project. So that's the difference between handing someone something and saying, here, finish this, and handing someone a task and saying, okay, this task needs to be done by such and such a date. It fits into this timetable. And when you do this, this is how it affects the other people in the project. So you really should have that second level of detail when you assign someone a task or a project. And with complex building or telecommunications projects, it may be useful to assign that project manager who can represent the agency with a selected vendor. And I know we have a lot of experienced people on this study session, and I think they would probably agree with me when I say that if you're going to have a new CAD or a new phone system or some large project like that, it's really a good idea to have a project manager either within your PSAP or hire an external for that. Which goes to the next bullet point. If you're a larger entity, you might have the staffing to handle that in-house, but smaller entities might need to contract out with third party. And there are consulting firms that will do that. So either way, your project manager is going to ensure that the vendor follows the contract specs to deliver the required goods or services, and also alerts the agency leadership to potential problems. So that project manager kind of has that 30,000-foot view eye on the project to make sure everything's running smoothly and that everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing according to the contract. Well, how do we know what they're supposed to be doing? And that's what the next several slides talk about. So these next several slides and this section are going to talk about the purchasing and the procurement process. If you've gone through this project or this process, you know that there are some very specific rules and guidelines to follow. And so, but it also varies by locality. So for example, if you're under a municipality, you might have a city department that does procurement for you, or maybe a county. If you're a standalone center, then you'll be doing that procurement yourself. If you have an authority board, they might be doing the procurement. So it really just varies by locality and your local laws and your agency's policies and procedures. But in general, most major purchases, which would be capital or those exceeding a specified dollar amount, like say a big furniture remodel or even a new comm center build, most of those purchases are made using a competitive procurement process such as the RFP, or by obtaining, so the RFP is a request for proposal. That's one way of getting information about costs, or by obtaining a number of quotes in a more informal, less structured manner. So if you don't put out an RFP, then you might put out and say, okay, well, I'm going to go to this company and get a bid, and I'm going to get this company and get a bid, and I'm going to go to this company and get a bid. Kind of similar to what you might do if you needed a new roof for your own house or something like that. So it really just depends on what your process is. The federal government has a whole federal acquisitions process. I was sent to a full week-long class to study this process in preparation for a role that I took on. I should have brought the book. The book is like that thick, and the class was 8 hours a day, 5 days that week, talking about procurement in the federal process. So if you really want to get some good sleep, you should get that book. Other items or other terms in the procurement process use in request for information and request for quote. So those are other ways of getting those information as well. There are a lot of places, most states and some other governmental entities, as well as the federal government, have what's called a piggyback contract for a lot of things. And that's where local entities are permitted to purchase commodities at the government contract price without seeking a competitive quote. So you'll have a lot of vendors who might say, you know, we have contract agreements, and that would allow the agency to go with that company rather than having to go through the competitive process or the bid process. So as you can see, there's a lot of different ways to procure your capital items, and you really need to double check with your leadership and your entity to figure out which one is going to be the right one for your agency. In general, if you're going to do RFP or RFI or request for quote or even bids, those proposals are going to be evaluated for technical compliance and then cost. And we're all in government and we're like, well, isn't cost the main thing? And yes, of course, cost is a important criteria, but you also want to make sure that the product that you're looking at is going to meet your needs and your technical criteria, which we're going to go into in detail here in a minute. You should always have legal counsel or a contracts manager consulted in this process. Always. And for additional reading, Nina has a request for proposal considerations information document, and you can find it using that document number. So the first part of this procurement process is a needs assessment. Okay, so it's time to get a new phone system into the communications center. And everybody's like, ooh, I went to conference last year and I saw this shiny thing and I saw that shiny thing and this thing and that thing. And everybody's like, yeah, and we wanted to do this and we wanted to do that. And that is great. But you need to formalize all of that into something called a needs assessment, which is where you'll define exactly what you need the system to do and require the system to do. So for example, a need and requirement of a phone system might be that it is capable of taking in next-gen 911 information and also can integrate with the administrative lines that are coming into the center, just as an example. So in the needs assessment phase, you're going to review all the tasks performed by PSAP personnel in relation to the product being procured. For example, the things that your phone system does right now that you like, you should not assume that the new system will also do that. You need to list that out. So you could start by saying, okay, what do we like about our phone system, and list everything that it does that you like that you want to make sure the new one does. And then you can go into, well, what do we not have that we want it to do, and list all of that. The example that the book gives is for 911 equipment. Oh, look, we're using that example. The features required to aid PSAP personnel in performing their daily job tasks should be listed as requirements. In other words, the ability to transfer out of the system should be a requirement. The ability to accept transfers into the system should be a requirement, and so on and so forth. The features that are not necessary to have, but we want it, like this would be really cool if it did that, those should be listed as options. And if they aren't too costly, then those items can be included in the final contract. So then you take that needs assessment and you develop a conceptual system design using those identified needs. And that's usually functional in nature rather than technical. So you want to ID what the product should do rather than how to do it. In other words, I would say, well, I want the system to be able to transfer calls out, but I'm not going to say it needs to transfer calls out by taking step 1 and step 2 and step 3 and so on and so forth. So it's a high level functional conceptual design. And you use that to justify a budget and the procurement. So you can take this needs assessment and you're going to use that in some pieces of the process down the road. So I'll just stop and see if anybody has any questions so far. All right. So once you have that conceptual design approved, then you can get into detailed design and technical specs of the RFP is developed. You can get into that. And that's where everybody's like, okay, now we need IT involved. Well, really, you should involve IT from the very beginning. But that's probably where people are like, yep, we need some help. So the more technically oriented aspects of that conceptual system are added to the technical sections of the RFP. And of course, if you're looking at a new phone system these days, you probably want to make sure that it's next-gen 911 compliant. And so you're going to be looking at standards. You're going to be looking at technical requirements. The RFP should consider the rules and regulations or terms and conditions of the issuing agency. So what your agency requires as terms and conditions. Those terms and conditions, if it sounds like contract language, that's because it is. It's going to contain a description of the project. It's going to contain general technical and functional requirements of the product, rules and regulations that have to be followed by potential vendors. In other words, if you're not going to let anybody into your center that isn't CGIS certified, then that needs to be in the terms and conditions. And an explanation to the vendors describing what the proposal formats should look like. So if you go out to RFP, or if you're even asking for just bids, you need to explain to the vendors what the product is that you want back. Like, do you want it in Word document? Do you want it in charts? Do you want it in so on and so forth? During the process of formalizing that RFP, a listing of those vendors who supply these types of product is developed, and you send the RFP document to those vendors. In other words, you want to make sure that this process is as fair and competitive as possible. And so you don't want to accidentally not send your RFP to this vendor or that vendor, because then they can come back and say that they weren't given a fair chance to compete. So part of the process of that RFP is doing some market research and saying, okay, what are all these companies that supply those types of product? If I'm buying a phone system, then who are all the companies that supply phone systems? And you make that list, and then you make sure you send out the RFP to all of those vendors. You also should place a public advertisement in accordance with local rules. And this is broad, and you should know that local rules sometimes include placing an ad in the physical newspaper. So keep in mind that, again, your legal counsel should be consulted, because they'll know all the rules in your area where you have to advertise that the RFP is open and ready for responses. So in the RFP, you give vendors a specific amount of time to provide their response to the RFP. And in some cases, you might hold a pre-bid or a pre-proposal conference to clarify the RFP. So that would be a time frame where you can invite all the vendors to come and ask questions before the RFP is released. Because once the RFP is released, there are very specific rules and guidelines about who can talk to whom and about what during that RFP process. Okay, so you've released your RFP. All the vendors have given everything back. You don't open them as they come in. You put them all in a pile. And then on the submission date, after you've gotten all of the proposals in, then you open them and you evaluate them using pre-established criteria relating to the needs requirements identified in the needs assessment. In other words, you don't just sit around the table and be like, yeah, I like this one, or no, I don't like that one, or I don't like this vendor, or whatever. Part of the RFP development is that you're going to establish that criteria ahead of time. And then when you open all the proposals, you go through that established criteria and you evaluate them based on X, Y, Z, A, B, C. Do they meet the terms and requirements? Can they meet our specifications? And so on and so forth. And it's a very formal process. So you've opened it up and you've rated each proposal according to that predetermined criteria. And then the proposals are ranked in order of most compliant to the requirements to the least compliant using that pre-established evaluation criteria. So for a phone system, you defined it and you said, okay, these are the absolute needs and requirements. And say you have 4 vendors that met those and you have 3 that didn't, like they can't meet all of the requirements. So you rank those 7 proposals in order of most compliant all the way down to least compliant. Then you get to invite the top vendors to provide an oral presentation of their product along with a demonstration. So for example, today we had a task force lunch and learn with a vendor, and they were giving a very specific overview and demonstration of a product. We had a lot of people who did not come to the lunch and learn today because they are in the RFP process and they could not be involved in that demo because it would violate the RFP rules and guidelines. In this oral presentation or demo, it's a very specific phase and you invite those top vendors and you follow the rules and regs. So using information gained from that proposal evaluation, the oral presentation and the demos. That you take all of that information and then you select a potential vendor as the most compliant with the overall requirements, including system price. Okay. Notice that you didn't pick the one you liked the best. You picked the vendor that is most compliant with the overall requirements. Whew, after all that, you get to go into contract negotiations. Fun, fun. Some people really like that part. Some people are like, no, thank you. Contract negotiations will also probably involve your legal counsel. And most vendors are going to have a standard contract. And most governmental agencies also have a standard contract, and they don't always match up. So now there's going to be some negotiations that have to take place in order to come to an agreement. And you're going to negotiate over things like price, features and functionalities, legal terms and conditions, when are the payments due, what are those payments looking like. The final contract should contain a final system acceptance test plan. And I think a lot of agencies kind of skip that part, but it's really important to have a comprehensive test plan that you can go through to make sure that the system is doing exactly what you wanted it to and what the contract says before you pay the vendor your final payment. You have to agree on what the final delivered product will look like and how it functions. Then, of course, you include those specific payment terms. And then after the contract is signed, you get to do the fun part. You get to implement the project. Yay. So a lot of these projects can span many months. It really just depends on the complexity. So longer and more complex contracts often result in the need to negotiate change orders. A change order is a modification to the original specs or costs, and the parties have to mutually agree on it. So you can imagine, okay, we're putting in a phone system and we come across a unexpected obstacle in this project. Okay. And so the agency is going to be like, oh, actually, we need to add this to the contract because we didn't know we needed this widget. And the vendor is going to say, okay, well, that's going to cost X amount of dollars. Well, that change can't happen until a change order is in place. Okay. Or if you need to substitute a new piece of equipment for one that's no longer available. Change orders are part of the contract. They have to be signed and executed as such, and you should keep them to a minimum because they complicate the process and they usually add to the cost. So you want to make sure that you keep them to a minimum for that reason, but you also want to make sure that change orders don't significantly alter the scope of the contract. Because remember when you went back to that, think back to when you did the vendor selection, right? So you're picking one vendor and that vendor's really happy and everybody else is probably feeling a sense of sadness, right? They didn't get picked. But sometimes that sadness extends to legal challenges where they think, oh, well, this agency didn't follow the proper procedure in choosing that vendor. And so they might challenge that original contract award. Well, if you're down the road into project implementation and you make enough change orders that all of a sudden it's not really the same project anymore, all those other vendors that you didn't pick can come back and say, well, wait, you didn't actually pick the project that you said you wanted, and we could have done that. So now we're going to sue you because you didn't follow proper procedure in awarding the contract. So that's another reason you want to keep those change orders to a minimum. After you choose the best options for the project, you get to plan. And the three most important areas of that process are a project timetable and a budget for the project and the resources needed to accomplish the project. And a lot of those resources are going to be human in nature, hence the assignment of duties. So talking about the timetable. So part of that vendor proposal is going to include an implementation timetable, and that's probably part of what you evaluated as in choosing this vendor. So the final contract should contain a realistic timetable for all the tasks involved in the overall project. And it's really helpful if it's in the form of a Gantt chart because you can see those specific tasks in a visual way along with their time frames and the person assigned to the task. So this is what a Gantt chart looks like. Yes, this is a picture taken directly out of the book. And if you haven't seen a Gantt chart before, this is what it looks like. It's a really easily visualized way to say, okay, well, this stuff, you know, that top piece, that top task is going to take very little time. That's why it's just on the line. And that next task is going to take a whole month. And the following task is going to run concurrently with the one above it. And that one's going to take 2 months, and so on and so forth. And that's how you can read a Gantt chart. And it should be reviewed really frequently by the project manager and the vendor to track the project progress and make those adjustments accordingly. So if item, I don't know, 1550 takes, you know, 6 days longer than it originally was planned, and item 1600 can't happen until 1550 is completed, you need to adjust your timetable to make sure that it reflects that so that everything else can be pushed out as necessary. You also need to have a research evaluation. So this is an evaluation of various options and alternatives prior to any action taken concerning major aspects of the PSAP. This thing right here it makes sense to me kind of where they put it. But of course you're going to do research of options and alternatives before you take action, right? You're going to look at, if you're going to buy a phone system, you're going to look at, well, do we need a phone system? Is our current phone system end of life? What would happen if we didn't do the phone system in this time frame, and so on and so forth. So as part of your decision process, of course, you're going to do some research evaluation. The other thing that goes into your thought process of capital projects are political considerations. And political considerations are just one of the many factors that enter into the procurement process. For example, the economical and technical perspectives may not coincide with the political environment. You might have several PSAPs in an area that could use a single CAD system, but maybe the agency heads of those particular PSAPs don't really get along. And so for political reasons, they're all going to pick their own CAD systems, even though it would be much cheaper to have one that they all shared. But the political environment is such that that's just not possible. The decision about whether to use public or private resources is also related to political considerations. Finally, you need to think about your network issues. So the migration to digital systems means that public safety systems can provide greater functionality, as well as the ability to integrate several different computer and database systems. This causes your network requirements to grow. So if you're moving from an analog system to a digital system, you need to be thinking about what kind of broadband or fiber or other network issues you might need to go along with that. If you are implementing a new phone system that's next gen 911 ready, you need to be thinking about, is it compatible with the types of lines coming into the center? Does it integrate with other systems that you want it to integrate with, like recording, like maybe logging systems, maybe reporting types of systems? So you always need to be thinking about your network issues as well when you're planning out large projects. Another concern is the cost and amortization period for high-tech systems. So how much does it cost up front, and how much is it going to cost over time, and what kind of maintenance do you need, and are you going to need to replace physical equipment down the line? You should also investigate whether it's better to lease a system or outright purchase it. So those are all things that you need to be thinking about in the procurement process. So that is the end of the management functions for this session. Now, I will say that when Jody Chin is going to teach next week's session, and when she and I were putting these together, we realized that what was originally stuffed into this one and what was originally stuffed into hers was too much for either one of those sessions. So we're going to add another session. So there will be more about PSAP administration and management next week, and then again the following week. But we're going to stop that for now. And so I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions on the procurement process or the assignment of resources or budgeting. Anybody who's gone through it have anything to add? Not
Even though it's pretty broad, I think it is a good overview of how to approach these things. And I think it's very useful.
Thanks, Chelsea. It's surprising to me that they don't cover more of the budgeting, because budgeting is such a large chunk of the PSAT manager's time. I know we've got a few PSAT managers on here. You don't have to speak up and share, but if you have any tips and tricks and words of wisdom for us, we'd be happy to hear it.
I'm always open to learn how to better budget or handle things differently.
Thanks, Kim. All right, well then moving on to public relations and education. This can be kind of the fun part of PSAP leadership. So public education has always been an important part of the industry, mostly because the way 911 was developed and quote unquote grew up in the public safety world. We have always been needing to educate people about how to call 911 and when to call 911 and what to do when you call 911. So the most common form is presentations in schools. And that's because kids are an easily accessible audience, right? They're in school 8 hours a day. They're usually open to learning. And so they are a great audience. And then they usually take that learning home and share it with everybody else at home because they're so excited to talk about what they learned that day, depending on the age, okay? Teenagers, not so much, but that's why a lot of public education is done in the elementary schools. You can also see a lot of public education going on at safety fairs and other like community events. But there's a difference between public education versus public relations. So the Public Relations Society of America defines public relations as a strategic communication process that builds mutually beneficial relationships between organizations and their publics. All that to say that public relations is about building a relationship with your different stakeholder communities, and public education focuses on a specific message to inform or educate the public. So can you be working on public relations while you're doing public education? Sure you can. But public relations is about establishing that relationship with your community. So maybe you have a social media page, and that is a type of public relations. That's a vehicle for public relations that you might just use for public education as well. Or you might go out and do education to your field responders about how 911 works. And that's also public relations. You might work to establish a relationship with the media or your 911 authority board or so on and so forth. Public relations is really, really important, especially in the 911 world, so that you can establish good relationships with the people that you're working with. So those stakeholders can include user agencies, government officials, because government officials know so much about 911, the news media, the business community, nonprofit organizations, and non-governmental organizations. And your public relations efforts can include day-to-day communications. So maybe you're in daily contact with some of these entities. You can work on responding to specific questions and concerns. You might deliver information about upcoming organizational changes. Here in Colorado, we've been pretty active with legislative changes lately, and will be so again this season. So it really just depends on what kind of information you want to share and what kind of relationship you want to build with these different stakeholders. But regardless of the stakeholder group or method of delivery, the message should be structured and delivered in a way to protect the 911 organization's professional reputation. I mean, obviously, we're not going to go out there and trash our agencies, but the book has this in there, and so that's what we're going to learn. Public relations is really vital to a successful 911 program. And if you think about it, we are the unseen heroes, and we have to work really hard to establish that relationship, because otherwise our field responders will grab all the spotlight and they don't always speak for us. So in the book, if you go to this section in the book 4.9.1, there is like 2 pages of ideas and resources. And I didn't feel like it was really a great use of the screen or our time to go through all of them. But for the purposes of the ENP exam, as well as your own education, I highly recommend you go to the book and read over those ideas and resources. They also recommend that you research the public relations efforts of neighboring agencies and 911 systems across the US and Canada. I would imagine when the first version of this study guide was written, social media wasn't quite as much a thing, but it is now, and especially in current revisions. So they recommend you look at social media and websites of other agencies and see how they're doing public relations. Other sources of information include NENA training courses and the NENA communications committee. So if you want to put together either a public education or a public relations campaign, or looking for some ideas on where to start, those are all great resources. So then it's like, well, what do we talk about? Well, this list seems to be the same all the time. When to call, how to call, and what to say. The book doesn't have this in here, but also explaining why people will ask so many questions when on medical calls. So explaining the EMD process. What's the proper use of 911? You might want to have a campaign on posting your 911 address. You could have a section or a series on this person is a 911 hero. How about you? Wireless 911, know your location. Text to 911 is a big one these days. Opting into emergency notification systems. There's no end to the list of things that we could use for both public education and public relations. I bet you guys could probably come up with a list yourselves of the things that you wish the public knew, right? Anybody want to be brave and unmute and say other ideas that you could use for public education?
I've always wanted to not necessarily educate the public on dispatch, but being prepared when you go in the mountains so you don't have to call 911.
Perfect. Love it. Anybody else?
Don't hang up. Call 911 and let it ring and let us know it was an accident, or don't hang up and then call back and think you'll get answered sooner.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Michael.
Even on 911, we might not know your exact location.
Yes. So be prepared to help us out with that. Perfect. All good things. So when you're developing, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, to follow what Mike said about we might not know your exact location, you might be able to give it to us faster than we can ping it.
Right. Sometimes the verbal is faster than the technology. Perfect. So when you're developing those topics, you should consider the issues associated with technology-specific challenges and limitations. I mean, that's like you just read that first bullet point there, Chelsea. Think about, well, okay, do we have a challenge with text? Do we have a challenge with location issues in rural areas? Do we have challenges with specific communities? Anytime you have a technology enhancement, we recommend, or NENA recommends, that you put out a public relations campaign or an education campaign on it. You could also include things like funding mechanisms, operational changes, current capabilities and responsibility of the organization, legislative stuff related to 911. Again, there's really no end to the things that you could use for your public relations campaigns. If you're lucky enough to have a whole team, or even if it's just you, The public relations team can improve how the public and other stakeholders view and support the organization. So if you have upcoming 911 related legislation, you can create a campaign to provide an overview of the organization, talk about the budget and funding constraints, clearly outline the work environment and the challenges. So you've kind of seen NINA and APCO do the same thing on a national scale when it comes to reclassification of 911. They've done all kinds of campaigns on what 911 does, why are 911 telecommunicators classified the way that they are, what do 911 telecommunicators do, what are the challenges, and so on and so forth. It's a really good example of that kind of campaign. Other ideas include organizing a statewide 911 goes to the Capitol, similar to 911 goes to Washington, which is coming up, by the way. So that happens every February, if you're depending on when you're watching this recording. Statewide conferences, regional association conferences, and organization of annual educational or messaging campaigns where you pick messages to focus on for the year. So if you know that you're having a big change coming up for your organization, and it's going to take a lot of public education and public awareness to make it work, then maybe you focus on that for the whole year and you just keep hitting the public over and over with these messages and different messages and that kind of thing. So I'm thinking about like emergency notification system. If you need someone to opt into your Everbridge or your Code Red, or you want them to sign up for Smart 911 or some of those things. Like at the state level, we've talked about maybe doing a statewide What 3 Words campaign. That could be an annual message that maybe you just sneak those messages in between other stuff that is like, you know, don't call 911 for fireworks at 4th of July, or so on and so forth. When you're crafting those messages, you need to be thinking about your target audience, okay? So if you're going to the elementary school, obviously your target audience is elementary school age children, and your message is going to be different. But I guarantee you, if you go to the high school with that same elementary school message, they're not going to care so much. In fact, they'll probably laugh at you for talking about Sparky the fire dog or whatever you want to talk about. So you need to target your audience with an appropriate message. And when you do that, increases the chance that the message is properly developed and delivered, and that the audience will receive and understand it. So keep in mind that your target audiences can include children of different ages, adults, which you would think would be everyone else, but you know, they have subcategories, senior citizens, deaf, blind, hard of hearing and speech challenged communities, special needs communities, non-English speaking communities. Voice over IP customers might be a specific target, especially if you need to send them the message that they need to update their address with their VoIP provider. Because as we know, if they move and take their VoIP phone with them, like I moved from Gypsum down to Grand Junction several years ago, if I hadn't called my VoIP phone provider and I called 911, guess who's going to get the 911 call? It's not going to be Grand Junction. It would be up there in Eagle County. So your VoIP customers might be a specific target. Field responders might be a specifically targeted audience. And of course, public and government officials are their own kind of audience. The thing you want to keep in mind with any message, you want to keep in mind the attention span of your audience, the literacy rate, vocabulary, the age group, ethnicity, and culture. Make sure that you are being culturally sensitive with your message, the experience level of your target audience, and the technical knowledge, right? You don't want to hit your average public audience with a whole bunch of technical jargon. Even though Stephanie said that we should memorize our acronyms for the ENP test, right? But if I go to the general public and I start throwing around terms like eSurf and Next Gen 911 and GIS and geospatial routing, and they're going to be like, what? So keep that in mind when you're developing your message. You want to make sure you're defining the objective. In other words, what's the point of my message? What do I want to get across? What do I want the audience to understand? And if there's a call to action, it needs to be clear and easy to remember. So if what you want the audience to do is opt into your emergency notification system, that should be very clear. Hey, if you want 911 to notify you in case of an emergency, sign up at and put in the thing. And then repeat that more than once in your message if you can. I don't think I need to say this to this audience, but the book says it. So we're going to highlight, if you're developing messages for your user agencies, do not assume that they know or understand what you do inside the walls of your PSAP. I will pause for laughter. You guys know all that. I know, right? Thanks, Michael. The method by which you disseminate your message is really important. So you could disseminate your message on printed materials. Have I handed out hiring flyers during Christmas parades? Why, yes, I have. Have I given out pens and pencils at safety fairs and farmers markets? Yes, I have. Electronic media. Social media, doing a traditional media campaign. Comcast and Spectrum would be happy to take your advertising dollars and put your message on TV for you. Presentation tours and PSAP tours. So presentation tour is, I have a presentation and I'm happy to bring it to the Chamber of Commerce meeting or your HOA meeting, or, pick your audience, right? PSAP tours, everybody likes to see what happens in a PSAP. Very popular. Booths at different events like farmers markets and other community events, and of course partnerships with other agencies are great message dissemination methods. And take advantage of your community resources as well. If you have volunteer fire departments or scout troops, they might be willing to go door to door for you and deliver stuff for you as part of community service projects. Your high school or college marketing classes might be willing to help you develop materials for a class project. Your fire and crime prevention officers are already doing some of the same work, so maybe you go with them, or maybe they incorporate your message into theirs. If you have them incorporate your message into theirs, make sure you watch their presentation before they go out and deliver it. Again, because we want to paint the 911 center in a good light and make sure that they're getting it right. Other community resources are teachers, nurses, home healthcare workers, and churches. Have we put 911 specific messaging on water bills? Yes, we have. So there's all kinds of community resources and ways to get your message across. There's also volunteer programs, and these tend to be associated with some of the larger agencies or entities under like law enforcement or sheriff's offices, but a volunteer program can be extremely beneficial in a public relations campaign. You need to make sure, though, that you train your volunteers properly so that they're providing a consistent message. And then Nina offers some ways to keep your volunteers happy, basically. Offer an incentive and recognition program for your volunteers, and make sure that you're awarding them, they recommend small gifts, tokens of appreciation, donated products, or gift certificates to keep improving your volunteer morale. I know a lot of you are like, hey, I would like some of that from my leadership, please. Well, all that to say that volunteers like it too. Everybody likes a sincere thank you for the work that they're doing. So when you're talking about who pays for all of this, more money means more options and expandability, but you can still have an effective public relations effort and public education effort without any budget at all. Sometimes there's sponsorship options for agencies. A lot of times you've got graphic artists who in your PSAP who are willing to put together flyers. I know a lot of people are really good at Canva, and you can develop some really good flyers with Canva. So it just depends on your creativity and how you want to get your message out. Do caution that you need to check your agency policy before seeking donations, because it would be really embarrassing to go out and solicit donations and then get in trouble with your boss. And then also look at grants as another funding option. And you can find grants in surprising places. Like a lot of banks have a grant program. Insurance agencies have grant funding for a lot of different things. And you could tie 911 stuff to a lot of things when it comes to insurance. So look for those grants in unexpected places. And finally, you can do a lot with research in developing your messaging. So you can use some PSAP statistics or telecommunicator feedback to guide your messaging. In other words, when I asked you guys the things that drove you crazy that you wish the public knew, your telecommunicators have some ideas on that as well. So they can be a really good resource for what your messaging might target. PSAP stats, like maybe if you want to say, well, you know, last month we got so and so many butt dials and they took up this amount of time, and we'd really appreciate it if you would lock your keypad or maybe not put your phone in your pocket in a certain way to cut down on those. Professional groups could be useful for research, or again, you can tap your students at a local college or university that might be looking for research projects. But you want to make sure you're evaluating the effectiveness of your campaign, especially if you're going for funding. So you need to measure the effectiveness. So you can do that by doing some pre-tests. Like before you run the campaign, maybe evaluate knowledge and understanding of a topic. And then after you run your campaign, do the same. You can determine the number of people reached, and a lot of social media has analytics tools. If you use a newsletter outreach service like Constant Contact or MailChimp, they will give you analytics on how many people received it, how many people opened it, how many people read it, and so on and so forth. Or highlighting media stories. If you do a public relations campaign and the media picks up on it, that's a really good indication that you've had some success. If you're doing presentations, then you can ask the attendees for feedback and use that to improve the message. And if there was a call to action, attempt to report the statistics before and after the message delivery. In other words, say, for example, you're trying to boost opt-in into your emergency notification system. So before you run your campaign, you would take note of the number of opt-ins that you have, right? And then you run your campaign, and then you go back and look, and you say, oh, we added 1,500 new subscribers after just 2 weeks of messaging. Well, that'd be a great return on your investment. And it would be a really good statistic to provide if you were asking someone for money. And by the way, asking your leadership for money, they're probably going to want numbers as well. You should build relationships with your media outlets before you need them. Now, 911 and media sometimes have a challenging relationship, mostly because the media tends to report only when we screw up. However, media are always looking for stories. So if you develop a relationship with them before you need them, and you give them information on stories, like, you know, if you've got Stork awards, like people delivering babies with EMD or saving lives, you do Lifesaver Awards, inviting the media to those presentations. Media can use those for filler stories, or maybe they use them for the lead. And that develops a really good relationship because you're giving them what they need, which is content, and they're giving you what you need, which is exposure. And building those relationships with those small things can come in really well and come in handy when you need to get the word out about increased requests for funding or legislative stuff that's coming up. So make sure you're presenting your message in a way that attracts their attention, and make sure that you are making the story newsworthy, right? Everything that we have to say, of course, is really important, but they don't always see it that way. If you've ever had to write a news release, this is the most commonly used tool for media relations. A lot of media are still used to getting news releases, even though in this day and age, it kind of seems like a quaint thing or an outdated method. But news releases are really useful because in a busy media center, they want all of it up front, right? They want to know, do I care about this, and why, and what's the angle? So a news release can still be a really effective way to get your message across. So if you're going to write a news release, you want it on agency letterhead. That way it proves your legitimacy. You need to have the mailing address on there, and you want it on double spaced and easily read type. Now is not the time for like 10-point font, okay? Make it bigger. Make sure you have the date of the release at the top of the page so they know if it's relevant. Include the name and the phone number of who they can get a hold of if they want more information. If that's you, make sure that you know you're going to be, your phone might ring off the hook. And then you use a inverted pyramid style. So you put the most important facts in the first paragraph. In other words, Today, telecommunicator Susie delivered not one, but 2 babies over the phone using the emergency medical dispatch protocol, right? And then you go into the next. The 2 babies were a boy and a girl, and this occurred at such and such a time. And you just kind of go down the list. So the most important stuff is up top, and then the less important stuff or the less relevant stuff comes down at the bottom. Your first sentence should include the 5 W's and an H. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. And it goes back to English class, huh? So your key tips for dealing with the media. First of all, you need to know your organization's policy. Who's allowed to talk to the media? What do you want to say? Does somebody else need to be involved? Know your media as well. If you're going out to meet with a reporter that has a history of asking very pointed questions, it's probably something you want to know in advance. Plan ahead. Make sure you know what you want to say. Ask for the questions that the media wants before the interview. So if they're asking you for an interview, see if you can get them to give you the questions ahead of time so you can prepare. And then take control. And by that, I mean be calm, cool, collected, put your best telecommunicator skills to use, and don't let them see you sweat. I'm going to stop there and see if anybody has any questions so far, because we just covered a whole lot of stuff in about 20 minutes. No questions? This might be the quietest group so far. All right. Special events are a great way to increase awareness of 911 issues. So you can just, like, Colorado is so big on special events, and you can go to just about anything and get your message across. You can put a float in the parade. You can do an appreciation event of 911. You can do telecommunicator week events, fundraising events, safety fairs. I mean, like farmers markets, local festivals, fill in the blank. Anything that, like 4-H fairs, rodeos, anywhere that has booths, 911 has a place, because we always need to get our message out and across. But when you're doing a special event, make sure that you've defined the goal and determine the supporting activities, okay? Make sure you've got a proposal and a budget. And if you need sponsorship, if it's allowed, make sure you secure that. It's always nice to invite special guests, like celebrities. They can be a great draw to your special event. Develop a timeline and a checklist to ensure success, and then assign people to those checklists items to make sure that they're done. Always have alternate plans, not only for weather, but have an alternate plan so that if things go sideways, you can do what 911 does best and roll with the changes. And then invite the media. They like to cover that stuff too. So specifically with Next Gen 911, as we transition to Next Gen 911, it's going to require specialized campaigns focused on the benefits and the features. A lot of the stuff that goes into Next Gen 911 happens behind the scenes, and sometimes the telecommunicators don't even see it, much less the public. But there are some aspects of Next Gen 911 that will be apparent, like text to 911, or when your agency starts accepting pictures and video to 911, and so on and so forth. So as you're messaging regarding your Next Gen 911 stuff, make sure you tailor the message for your different stakeholder groups, okay? 911.gov has some great creative content for this. But for example, you might have a public program to explain those extended capabilities. You might need a field responder campaign to talk about how Next Gen 911 and FirstNet will improve information sharing between the 911 center and the field. You might need a legislator program focused on financial and legislative needs, because Next Gen 911 is going to be expensive. So be thinking about that when you're thinking about your public education and relations campaigns. All right, that is the end of public relations and education. So who's got questions on that? Anybody with questions or success stories of their public education campaigns that they want to share? All right. 2 more slides. We're going to talk about policies and procedures. So a policy manual and a procedure manual can be the same thing, but they also can be different things, and they should be living documents. And by living documents, I mean, you all know that the only constant in the 911 center is change, and your policies and procedures must keep up with what's actually happening in the 911 center. So your policies are going to set the framework for how the agency functions. In other words, in a policy manual, if I'm a new employee to your center, I should be able to find in the policy manual, what is the dress code? What time should I show up for my shift, or when am I considered late? What are the sexual harassment policies? And so on and so forth. No, I'm not going to sexually harass anybody. Neither is anybody else, okay? But the procedures are going to provide rules and guidance regarding specific tasks. So in the policy manual, I get an overall framework for how I show up. But in the procedures, you're going to tell me as a new employee, how do I answer the phone? I take this step, and then I take this step, and then I push this button. And to transfer somebody, I'm going to press this button, and then this button, and this button. And that's a procedure. So in the PSAP setting, your policies are developed to fulfill the mission. And you also want to make sure your policies allow for unusual circumstances that require deviation from the norm. In other words, stuff's going to happen that's unexpected, and you want to make sure that your policies are flexible enough to allow a person to take what they feel is the best action that's best for the person and the organization, right? Those are all those differences between shall and should and must and may, where shall and must, you have no flexibility, and should and may, you have some discretionary items or flexibility. When you're developing your procedures, you should be coordinating with your training personnel and your quality assurance practices, because your training personnel are going to be able to tell you where your policy or where your procedures are weak and need shoring up. And your quality assurance practices are going to give you constant feedback on where people are a little bit shaky on their grasp of the procedures and what needs extra training, okay? And in an ideal PSAP, by matching your procedures, your training, and your quality, you can formulate a process for finding those gaps and trends and then closing them. That's all the book says about development of policies and procedures, if you can believe that. So who has questions on policies and procedures? Okay. Who has questions about anything we talked about so far tonight? Are you guys okay? Chelsea, do you have anything to add?
I was just thinking when you were talking about special events, when you were talking about public relations, it kind of took me back to the budget and thinking about in raising your revenues is think about those special events too. Are you providing free 911 services specifically for those events that you could actually be charging the event coordinators for?
Yeah, good point. Well, thanks for being here, Chelsea. So when we started these ENP study groups, we put out call for volunteers for people to lead them. And Chelsea was one of the volunteers. So I appreciate you being willing to jump in and help out. And thank you, everybody, for spending your Thursday night with us. We very much appreciate it. We'll see you next Thursday, and have a great evening.
Thank you. You as well.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.